All right, good morning. This will be your first video on our next author, Junot Diaz, who wrote The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. We will do this over 2 weeks, so this will be the first part of the video introducing you to Diaz, a little bit about Dominican Republic history, and setting up some of the major things that are being explored in this novel. Wonderful novel. I imagine some of you have probably read it before. It's recent, it's fairly popular, and very well received by critics and readers alike. And Diaz himself is a very current, very trendy and hip and young voice in literature, who has been writing for some time, but even right now he's still very much considered a rising and prominent literary star in a lot of ways. If you watch the video that I put up, the interview and question and answer session with him, that's about an hour long, you're going to learn a lot about him and who he is as an individual, but also his thoughts on writing in general and merging, history into his writing, and creating this very specific style that's based on who he is. And the interview is a little longer than some of the other ones that I've posted for the class, but I wanted you to be able to hear him talk about a number of different things. And of course you'll recognize the interviewer from NPR, and so he's well-known voice as well, and he interviews lots of famous writers and people, etc. But Diaz's personality, in fact, on this video is a little bit more tempered than he usually is. He's a little bit quieter on this video than he normally is. And those of you that have taken my class before know that I teach Diaz in several other classes and several other books and short stories that he's done, and I will show you different videos, and sometimes you'll see him reading and he'll be very animated and in a much more, not necessarily loud sort of manner, but in a way that suggests his youth and sort of excitement about things. This video's got him a little bit more tempered, and he's got his arms crossed, and he does this a lot. He's very much, what's the word? Not proud, but he's very driven by his own particular background, and he inserts this into his stories and his novels, often in the guise of a mix between characters. And in this novel, you have Junot, who is a character he's brought over from other stories he's written in the past, and he projects a lot of his own particular experience growing up between the Dominican and between New Jersey, and being a little bit of an outsider in some ways through Junot's eyes. And in Oscar Wilde, we also get some of the elements of his background, Diaz's background, through the character of Oscar as well. So anyhow, a little bit more about Diaz, just so you can sort of understand who he is and how he's got to be such a prominent writer in the 21st century. So he was born in Dominican Republic, 1968, which means he's 48 years old. And he moved to New Jersey when he was 6 years old in the 1970s. New Jersey, of course, very industrial, very urban, lots of different spaces where he says, highways were running right next to his house, and the dump is right next to the place that he lives. So he is very keen to describe the way that his youth looked not idyllic in any sort of way. So while he was in New Jersey, he began to write as a young boy, and he went to Rutgers, where he finished a BA, and then he worked his way through college doing a series of, crappy jobs, different things, restaurant jobs, kitchen jobs, etc. And he worked for Rutgers Press while he was there as well as an editorial assistant. So after he graduated, he was accepted to an MFA program at Cornell, and this is where he begins crafting and putting together the short stories that would comprise his first book, which was called Drown, and it's a collection of short stories, and this was published in 1996. And prior to that, he was publishing these stories individually in places like the New Yorker and the Paris Review, and these and some other stories were put together and published in 1996. And the subject, the topic of many of these stories had to do with young Latino males and the particular problems that they face. And he explores everything from not having his father around to wanting his father around, questions of how to be macho as a young Latino boy, questions of homosexuality and how that worked into his world, and many different ways to express the outsiderness of young Latinos in different scenarios. And then you couple that with Latino young men who grew up in less than stellar neighborhoods, who have an affinity for writing or have an affinity for things that he calls nerdy, like Dungeons and Dragons and Tolkien and other sort of stereotypically nerdish type things. And he explores that. How does that sort of threaten one's manhood and one's Latino presence? And all of these things and others, come up in the stories of Drown. And it garners him lots of attention in 1996. And he's very much an explosive force in the mid to late 90s on the literary scene. And he's a well-known name. And then he begins working on a novel in the late 90s into the early 2000s that would sort of build on these ideas that he's explored in his previous short stories, right? What's it like to be young, brown, male, growing up, between two different sort of cultural worlds, and literally traveling back and forth from New Jersey and the Dominican, and trying to deal with all the other problems that just face teenagers in general, right? Are you cool? Are you, attracting to the opposite sex? Are you meeting the sort of benchmarks that make you acceptable? Are you an outsider? Are you being, driven to the outside because of things that you are attracted to, such as these nerdy things, or writing and expressing emotion and being pensive when you should be much more active? All of these things are part and parcel of the background to Oscar Wilde. He also throws in, an awful lot of Dominican history that sort of overarches and underpins at the same time what's going on in the lives of these characters. Okay, and you have three sort of major characters throughout the Oscar Wilde novel. They're, as he says in the video, these are, I think he says something like they're non-Dominicans because they're three characters who go to college and they value education and they value these sort of things, played off against, what are sometimes positioned as stereotypes. And that's part of that sort of grappling with, cultural pulls in both directions. Dominican, cultural tradition, of the machismo-driven male, and then, other sort of counter traditions that suggest, well, I can express how I feel, I can be into these other things that are not cool, not, sort of posturing, that sort of thing. And the world that I live in allows me to sort of explore that a little bit more, even though Oscar receives a tremendous amount of backlash because of the choices that he makes. Junior, on the other hand, is sort of, slipping along in the background, trying to, travel, in a very slippery path that allows him to both posture himself as a hyper male and also explore this other emotional and quote non-cool side of himself, and it's a very specific way that Diaz portrays their relationship as the novel goes along. Okay, there's a real strong emphasis in the novel, which he published in 2007, and it won the 2008 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. So, as I said earlier, it's well received, well reviewed, and widely read and appreciated. But there's a real strong emphasis on the fact that the land of freedom and hope, this American landscape portrayed from his New Jersey upbringing, is not as shiny and as far apart from their sort of supposed or purported homeland tragedies. Okay, and so this is sort of why he gives us so much in the way of Dominican history throughout. Right, the opening of the novel, discusses this wonderfully, crafted idea of the fuku, or the curse that exists, throughout, and has showed up and has sort of followed its way through this lineage and will be showing its head at different points in the novel, right? This idea that this particular line of history or tradition has been, messed up, by this, term that, it's wonderful how he plays with it, in that it could be spelled or read phonetically as, fuck you. It's this, don't get too high and mighty, because these things, these tragedies are lurking in the background. And he gives us, in those footnotes as well, these fascinating historical connections to characters and to moments in the Dominican history that are, some well-known, some not well-known at all. And they give a richness to the narrative in the present day that is, that, for one thing, it reveals Diaz's own, desire to connect history to present day, but it also shows that the characters in the novel are living out some of, they carry these historical moments within them, and they are appearing in their present day lives, in the form of this fuku, or just, drama and trauma in general. So a little bit about the Dominican and United States history would help here, right? We obviously know that this is where Christopher Columbus first landed in 1492, and it became the first permanent European settlement in the Western Hemisphere at Santo Domingo. It is the first permanently established settlement by Europeans in the Western Hemisphere, and it exists to this day. Okay, fast forward about 400 years, and the Dominican finally achieves independence from Spain in 1821. But if you know anything, even a little bit, about the history of the Caribbean, you know that the Dominican shares its geographic location with Haiti. They occupy the same island, and Haiti takes over Dominican Republic soon after Spain leaves, and the Dominican gains their independence from Spain. And so Dominican then is at war, at conflict with Haiti for a couple decades before achieving their independence in 1844. Into the 20th century, during the time of the First World War and into the 1920s, the United States actually occupied the Dominican Republic. And if you remember from our discussion of Cuba and Puerto Rico, you know that the United States presence in the Caribbean has been sort of, at times very, very neo-colonial and at times just sort of culturally influenced. But this was an actual occupation for about 8 years, 1916 to 1924. Coming out of this and entering into the 30s, the Dominican enters into its own period of tyrannical dictatorship that is what primarily is driving Diaz's reference to Dominican's history. In 1930, a man by the name, maybe you've heard of him, you should have, a man by the name of Rafael Trujillo took over the country. Okay, and during that 30 years that he ruled the Dominican, he ruled in a very military sort of tyrannical, as I already said, is the best way to describe it, state that was oppressive and ruled by a very closed-off circle of leaders, that prominently brought the Dominican forward in a lot of ways, but oppressed an awful lot of dissidents and intellectuals and non-landowner owners, etc. And during his 30-year presidency or dictatorship, there are estimates that he was responsible for the deaths of over 50,000 people. And Trujillo, as Diaz will go into in many of these footnotes, was, an incredible, horrible man, and who infiltrated many different parts of the Dominican Republic's culture after this, right? I mean, he would be held up there as a sort of Stalin-esque figure in a lot of ways, murdering his own people, executing his own people, and so the Dominican comes out of this period, very, very traumatized, and he exists as a touchstone to reach back to, and Diaz does an excellent job. I haven't seen a better job than in the footnotes and in the historical context that he gives in Oscar Wilde to explaining what was going on during this time. The U.S. invades Dominican in 1965, a few years after Trujillo was assassinated, and invades, ends the civil war that had resulted, and puts the country back on the road to a democratic government, with some problems and some issues to come after this. But it's worth noting that Trujillo's supporters and his closest allies and leaders are, and Diaz will show you some of them throughout. It's worth noting that they are equally as horrific in a lot of ways as Trujillo was in his methods of ruling, and it's sad. Obviously, it's sad, but one of the other sadnesses is that Trujillo's name is not often mentioned when you consider 20th century dictators on a massive level, such as him. You'll hear the typical names, but often people will not realize who exactly Trujillo was and what sort of a man he was. Diaz is very aware, and he wants others to be as aware, as well as pointing out how much he is tied to a Dominican sense of history and culture, right? So he does this very skillfully in a way that I don't think takes away from the narrative of the story he's trying to create with Oscar, with Junior, in a way that will inform rather than distract your reading. And so I urge you not to skip over those footnotes and not to move past and on to the plot and what's going on. A little bit about the novel, just to get us started. Diaz's voice is very stylized in a lot of ways, and you hear him talk on the video interview, and he sounds very influenced by a sort of hip hop, street, young way of speaking and talking, and he's not afraid to curse, on stage in front of these people, and with this NPR interviewer there, he's got the look of a very comfortable and young person who's knowledgeable about hip and current ways of presenting oneself, and he's, as I said, he's 48, so he's nearing 50, but he's a lot younger in terms of the way that he sees things and the way that he speaks, and so this is reflected in his style, and the novel itself has a lot of sort of vulgar and immodest subject matter in a way that is very youthful, right? I mean, Oscar's chief concern, or one of his chief concerns, is that he's not able to get girls as well as Latino males. Dominicans in particular are supposed to bring in girls, right? This is a part of being a Dominican in stereotypical perceptions, right? The fact that you, and to use the way that Diaz has his narrator write it, you pull ass, right? This is the way that Latino men are supposed to be. And Oscar, there's the wonderful story from when he's young of how he was always, the girls, were attracted to him for various reasons, and he was cute and this and that. But as he got older, he got fatter and he got nerdier and he got much more of an outsider identity, and it becomes very, very prominent that he's not going to be that sort of Latino machismo attraction to other girls. And so his focus on sex and sexuality and his experience or lack thereof, and this idea that he's going to die a virgin, drives much of his decision, even though he continues to not watch what he eats, and he continues to not pursue a different sort of identity construction. It still drives who he is. And so the vulgarities of it, right? It's not written in any sort of flowery, innocent way. Oh, when will I find love? Or, why don't the girls like me? It's written in this very much accurate voice of young men, boys, and it's real and it's authentic in a lot of ways. He also, Diaz rather, includes, along with these footnotes about Dominican history, there's an awful lot of pop cultural referencing in the book, from Tolkien to Dungeons and Dragons to mythology to Star Wars and lots of these other things that are pop cultural that again add to that authenticity of this particular lifestyle. And it's doing a couple things. It's placing Oscar and Junior very much in an American cultural setting, owing that there's this very specific 1970s, 80s, pop cultural scene being set up, But it's also putting that alongside all this Dominican history and this Dominican culture that suggests that yeah, while this might be a very American thing, it's been absorbed and has reached out to just about anybody who wants to go and get it, and to have such a crucial, critical, detailed understanding of how this functions for Oscar and Junior to an extent as well. It is Diaz's way of saying that this boy, this young man, is a product of Dominican upbringing and also just as much an American cultural product as well. Okay. Some other things that are important to understand. The novel is multi-generational. It's transnational. It travels between the Dominican and the United States. So we have some of those elements of a diaspora, right? Diaspora of immigrants abroad and their generational children, and how they're experiencing their upbringing, etc. But then it's also multi-voiced, right? The narration, the point of narration, will shift a couple of times throughout the novel. I've mentioned this a couple times already, but Diaz himself talks about this in the interview, the idea of the outsiderness of the novel, right? He's outside, Oscar Wilde is outside of the male macho Latino. He's outside of, sort of the American, cool scene of jocks and preppies and being involved in all these other things that are not nerdy. And he's very much outside of any sort of bland general description of an American dream early on in the novel, and we have to watch that as we go through, and maybe we'll talk about that a little bit in next week's video. And then also I've mentioned these last 2 points. The novel is historical, right? It begins with references to all of this I've shared with you about the old 15th century and on, history of the Dominican up to the 20th century. And then the footnotes are part of that extended narrative. And you might judge for yourself how they fit into that narrative, but I see them as extending the narrative beyond and giving a literal subtext to what is being projected in our present, in the period where we're meeting Oscar Jr. and all the other characters. I'll leave it at that for this week. Could read about halfway through. I think the syllabus schedule has an actual page where I suggest getting. Take some notes and things. There's no reading response for this week. If you saw the email from yesterday, you'll want to talk about the entirety of the novel in your reading response that will be due next week after we get through the second half of the novel. Okay, enjoy. This is one of the more fun reads of the class. It's entertaining in a lot of ways, although it may not be to everybody's taste, but it's you can go in understanding that it's been appreciated in lots of different circles, from literary and critical to popular and entertaining. So have fun, and I'll see you on next week's video.